And what's interesting is that even though you only used your right hand to eat, there were two exceptions. When you served the bread, you always served it with two hands. And when you served the cup of wine, you always served it with two hands. Why? Because the blood and the bread represented life in its two forms, the body and the blood of the flesh. Bread was the life. We call it the staff of life. This was the thing that sustained them throughout their days. And so when you presented bread to your guests, you presented it in both hands, and you would be basically saying, I'm extending to you the gift of life. And the same thing would be true with the cup. The blood of the grapes was a symbol of man's blood, and you would hand it as if it's the very essence of life itself. As you drink of this, as you eat of this, we are partaking together in our lives, sharing our lives together. How literally did they take that? Well, even today in the Middle East, eating a meal together is powerfully symbolic. When President Clinton brought, Begin and Menachem Begin not Clinton, but Carter, Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat of Egypt, to Camp David to make a peace accord, which led to basically an end of hostility between Egypt and Israel that's stood to this day. But when he brought them together, the final event was they sat down and had a meal together. And when Sadat ate that meal with Begin, he signed his death warrant. He was assassinated not too many years after that because of that event. Because at that moment, when he ate with Begin, he was essentially saying, we have entered into a covenant of salt, a covenant of brotherhood. And the same way that when you would want to show that your love and friendship for someone, you would break the bread and you would actually stick it in his or her mouth. You would feed them with the bread. And by doing that, what you're saying is a number of things on various levels. First of all, you'd say that if there's any hostility between you and me, I forgive you. You'd secondly be saying to them, I love you as I love my own brother. We are now flesh of one another's flesh. And you would be saying that as long as you're under the roof of my house, I will protect you with my life. So that when we read in Acts 2 about how that they went from house to house breaking bread, they're not talking about potluck. They were talking about how they endeavored to maintain that commitment and that loyalty and that clarity of fellowship with each other. They were coming together regularly from house to house, reaffirming their love for one another. They were coming together regularly, reaffirming their forgiveness for transgressions and offenses that had risen between them. They had reaffirmed their commitment to stand together until death do us part. It was powerfully significant, and that's why we read these kind of statements. Well, they went house to house breaking bread, and it just goes right over the top of our heads because it means nothing to us. But even today in the Middle East, it means everything. And that's why when Bill Clinton brought what was that guy that used to be there? Arafat, yes. When he brought Arafat and Barak, Ehud Barak from Israel together again at Camp David, trying to replicate what Carter had been able to do, what happened? Well, Arafat wouldn't eat. He wouldn't eat with Barak because he said, if I do, I'll die. He remembered what happened to Sadat. If I tell the Middle East, the whole world of the Middle East, that I have entered into a pact of brotherhood with this Jew, I'm a dead man. I won't even get off the plane. Because he understood the symbolism of breaking of bread. So that when Jesus brought his disciples together, he was bringing them not into a moment of ritual observance. He was bringing them into a tremendously powerful teaching moment. He had brought them together to begin to communicate something about himself and also things that they needed to understand about themselves. But before I get to that, let's talk a little bit about the seating order around the table. 12 places. And it's interesting. Jesus told his disciples, he said, literally in the Greek it says, go to the ketaluma. Ketaluma was a specific room that was designed for these kind of feasts. In Jerusalem, there would be as many as 1 million or more people who would come from all over the world to Jerusalem to observe the Passover feast. And it was so crowded, there was no room in the city itself. They would fill the hillsides and the mountains all around. In fact, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was arrested, was the region where the tribes coming from Galilee were assigned as their campgrounds. And the same was true with all the mountains that surrounded Jerusalem. But you see, Catalumas, therefore, were set up. In fact, they had roasting ovens all over the city for people to cook their lamb and other things. I mean, it became a real major industry. In fact, the reason that Herod expanded the temple to the massive size that it became, the platform, was to kind of try to accommodate this hundreds of thousands of people that would show up for these feasts. In fact, the Temple Mount today that's theirs, you can put 5 great pyramids on top of that. It can hold as many as 100,000 people at one time on the top of the Temple Mount. And that was built for the temple, not for the Dome of the Rock or the Mosque of Omar. But you see, these rooms were set up specifically for this purpose, and because the ruling of the rabbis was that when we partake of this Passover, every Israelite needs to eat like a king. Why did they say that? Because of what Passover represented. Passover represented the deliverance from Egypt and the freedom from slavery. And this took special significance to the Jews because they were a people at that time who were essentially in slavery. They belonged to the emperor in Rome. That's how Rome viewed it. And they were not a free people, and they weren't self-governing, and they yearned for it. That's why we find that Pilate and his armies were in Jerusalem at this time of year in the first place. Pilate didn't stay in Jerusalem. He stayed down in Caesarea Maritima, the city that Herod had built, a Greek-Roman city with all the luxuries and comforts of a Roman city, one of the most beautiful Roman cities in the world. In fact, Agrippa, the commander of Caesar Augustus' army, when he visited the city of Caesar, says, "You are more Roman than Rome." And so as a Roman, he wanted to live down there and enjoy the life. He could eat pig. He could sacrifice to his various gods. He could go to the theater. They had horse racing. They had all the luxuries. The brothels and all that stuff were in Caesarea. But he knew that when Passover came, he better be in Jerusalem because almost every revolt of the Jews started in Jerusalem during Passover. In fact, we know that in a 100-year period, there were 5 major revolts. All of them started at Passover. That's why the Romans were so quick to arrest Paul. When somebody said, "He's causing all these problems," the Romans came rushing in, arrested him, and carried him away. Because they were always on the ready. And that's also why we find that the high priest, when they wanted to get rid of Jesus, what did they do? They accused him of insurrection. He's calling himself a king. He's seeking to rebel against Rome. It was something that Pilate could not ignore. Especially when they said, if you don't do it, we'll send an embassy to Rome and tell them that you're not a friend of Caesar because you've supported this anti-Roman leader in our midst. And Pilate at that time was in a bit of political difficulty. He had been appointed by Caligula. Caligula was now gone, and they were purging the Roman Empire and government of all of Caligula's appointments, and he had been one of them, and so he knew he was in trouble, and eventually he did get in trouble. He actually got deposed, both him and Caiaphas at the same time. But it helps us to date the time of the crucifixion a little more clearly. But here, what's interesting in all of this is that because it represented freedom, they said that who are the free people in our land at this time? Well, only the kings and the rulers. Everybody else was a slave. So one time a year you should eat like a rich man. And how does a rich man eat? He eats at a triclinium. He eats at this 3-sided table. And he eats laying on cushions, leaning on his left arm and eating with his right arm. And so what we know is that they also established, again, a pecking order of where people would sit. And it was interesting because the very first place, which would be at the head of the table, as you're looking out towards the front door, the first place would always be the friend of the host. In other words, whoever he picked to sit in that place was the one who was identified as the